Welcome back to another episode of the Disaster Dog Podcast, where we talk everything canine related to USAR. Mike and I are sitting in studio recording right now. We're doing a little intro. We're going to call this the Hijack episode. Dr. Jennifer Brown went up to Alaska to work an event with Dr. Davis, and on her way up there, she decided that some of the information that he had studied
was must listen to.
A lot of our dogs are coming from cooler climates, going down to Texas heat, and he is a huge body of wealth when it comes to working dogs in the heat and acclimation, hydration, work performance. So we're going to call this the Hijack episode.
Disclaimer: Hijack episode 1.
Hijack episode 1, probably.
I'm sure we'll probably have more.
Yeah, it's a cool concept.
It is.
So
Tim's going to do one.
Yeah, we could do one. Mm-hmm. Everybody, we are going to put a disclaimer out there. The audio is not the best. Our sound engineer, Jeremiah, is going to work his magic. But we thought this information was extremely important for those hot deployments, and everybody could learn something from it. And shout out to Jen Brown, because she bought her own equipment and hauled it to Alaska to get this recorded. So thank you, Jen Brown. Thank you, Jeremiah. And once again, thank you, Chicago's Bravest. This is episode 8. Jennifer Brown, remote in Alaska with Dr. Davis.
Enjoy.
Thanks for checking out the Disaster Dog Podcast, where we talk all things canine, urban search, and rescue. The views and expressions are opinions of the hosts and guests and do not represent those of any government agency that we work for or contract work to. We're just a couple idiots with microphones.
I'd like to thank Rami and Mike for letting me take over the Disaster Dog Podcast, talk about some health issues in working dogs. This is Dr. Jennifer Brown, Florida Task Force 2 canine handler, as well as an IST veterinarian. And today I have with me Dr. Mike Davis. So Dr. Davis, welcome to the Disaster Dog Podcast. I'd like to start with just introducing yourself. Obviously, I know you, I've known you for decades, but the working dog world, especially in the USAR environment, might not be as familiar. So if you could just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and what you do.
I'm a veterinarian. I'm a board certified internist, board certified sports medicine specialist. But both of those certifications are in equine, because when I went to vet school, I was bound and determined to become the world's greatest horse vet, and went through all that, actually determined that I had a much stronger interest in research, and so decided that I was going to become a researcher in veterinary sports medicine, exercise physiology. And so that's what I have been doing for the last nearly 30 years at Oklahoma State University College of Veterinary Medicine.
So we have a similar path. Our paths have touched remotely in several ways. I started out in equine surgery. I was at the Marion DuPont Scott Equine Medical Center, which is where you did your residency.
Correct.
I was big in equine exercise physiology as a vet student at Washington State, working with Dr. Warwick Bailey, who you've also done a lot of research on equine exercise and exercise physiology. But now both of us are more known for our role in canine, me, sports medicine and rehabilitation, and you in canine exercise physiology research. How did you get on the path towards canine exercise physiology?
Well, I basically the world of exercise physiology in general, the more you get into it, it's almost a completely separate field from regular old, medical physiology. Now, horses, for centuries, we've understood them to basically exist as athletes, and so when you learn equine veterinary medicine, you're basically learning equine sports medicine, because ultimately that's what they're supposed to do. It turns out that an exercising dog is very, very different from a resting dog. And I came to find out that an exercising dog is more like an exercising horse than an exercising dog is like a resting dog. So moving from exercising horses to exercising dogs turned out to be a very, very small jump. That's just the way I've been trained to think about the subject, whether it's a 1,200-pound horse or a 60-pound dog. So when we had questions that needed to be answered, that I felt should be answered, it was very easy to simply use a dog instead of a horse to answer those questions.
Smaller subject.
Smaller subjects, in a lot of cases, more economical to do research with. But also, I just through a accident of timing, I wound up being confronted with a problem that was specific to dogs that absolutely needed to be fixed, just not because I wanted to. I happened to intersect with racing sled dogs at a time when there were too many racing sled dogs that were dying of gastric ulcers and gastric ulcer related stuff. They needed help to fix that problem, and I was willing to be that help.
So your equine exercise physiology research overlapped or intersected with canine exercise physiology research via sled dog.
Correct.
And as far as your equine research goes in that intersection, would you consider that maybe your most profound research in the equine? Or what would you say was your most profound or impactful research on the equine side, and then also on the canine side?
Actually, the two paths, doing equine exercise physiology research and doing canine exercise physiology research, have sort of looped back and forth against each other for the last 30 years. Right now, they're coming back together in terms of studying how the various skeletal muscles actually produce the energy needed to conduct the exercise. That work's taking place in both dogs and horses. And we're looking at both similarities and differences, but that's probably some of the most impactful stuff right now, because we are actually drilling down in a very precise manner on not only how they run out of energy and start to fatigue, but also how they damage the muscle during exercise. And there are a lot of similarities between dogs and horses in that regard.
So I'd like to challenge you a little bit on that, because I think if you asked mushers that your most impactful research, actually going back to your work with gastric ulcers, they would consider that the most impactful, wouldn't you say?
I think they probably would.
Because it actually saved lives. So
it actually did save lives, and admittedly, my team and I that conducted that work, myself, Kathy Williamson, Mike Willard, we put a lot of years into that. But ultimately, we essentially eliminated the leading cause of death in racing sled dogs. And that's definitely something that all three of us are very, very proud of.
As you should be. Can you give us disaster dog handlers, just a little highlight on that. Well, may not be a direct correlation because obviously our dogs are not racing sled dogs working in that capacity, nor have we identified gastric ulceration being a common problem that we encounter. But I think it's just interesting for us to hear, what profound things can happen with research and how it can really impact how our dogs perform.
The gastric ulcer problem was it wound up being a much larger problem than folks realized. What you could see sort of on the surface was the stereotypical tip of the iceberg. You might have 2 or 3 dogs a year die of something related to gastric ulcers or gastric inflammation. When we started looking at it, it turned out that below the surface, we're looking at 60% of dogs, literally hundreds and hundreds of dogs that were at risk for this. Created a huge challenge in so far as we're no longer trying to figure out which 3 dogs are going to die. That proved very rapidly to be completely impossible. What we had to do was prevent the start of the process in the entire population, the thousands of dogs a year that are actually participating in this sport. And we had a really good idea of how to do that in a resting dog. The same medications that humans use to prevent stomach ulcers are just as effective in horses and just as effective in dogs. But in a population of racing sled dogs, you have the challenge of actually getting the drug effectively absorbed. All of those drugs do not get absorbed well in the presence of food. And a racing sled dog is consuming, or at least attempting to consume, up to 12,000 calories a day. Its stomach has almost always got something in it in order to try to digest and absorb that many calories. So the challenge of trying to get these medications delivered to the dogs on an empty stomach without interfering with their ability to exercise proved to be a substantial logistical hurdle. And we had to work with the sled dog racing community, the expert mushers throughout, to figure out a strategy that would accomplish the medical requirement, but also accomplish the sporting requirement. And took a few years. We finally did get that done, and it has proven to be very, very effective. But it was a cooperation between the scientific community and the dog community, the individual owners of the dogs and the handlers and the mushers and the kennels. They had to be an active part of it. Otherwise, this wasn't going to work.
And in conclusion, you identified a specific drug that now all mushers use.
Well,
majority.
The majority of them use when it's indicated. It's simply one of the over-the-counter proton pump inhibitors, Prilosec, Nexium, something like that. But they have to slightly adjust their management schedule so that at least at one point every day during the exercise, the dog can have a mostly empty stomach to receive that medication and then resume the regular racing schedule. But it requires that little bit of additional manipulation of all the other things that the mushers have to deal with in order to successfully compete.
But significantly decreased mortality.
Pretty much completely eliminated. Mortality.
I would say 100%. It's pretty excellent and profound as far as that goes. So, certainly, why not directly applicable to the USAR dogs? Certainly things to think about, and how much studying of exercise physiology and our working dogs, in the face of work can make, significant health differences. But that's not why I wanted to tie you to a microphone today. A big reason that I wanted us to have this conversation is because you've also done a fair bit of research on the canine side on, I call it, you corrected me on this, on talking about acclimatization. In our urban search and rescue environment, we're often working in hot and humid environments. The majority of our deployments tend to be post-hurricane, post-floods, like the Texas floods last year, Maui, the Lahaina wildfires, another hot environment. And often our dogs have to come from other environments that are much cooler than the area that they're deployed to. And this may not just be in the face of deployment. We may also see this in the face of testing. Next month, we're having a test down in Florida, and we have people signed up from the test where there's still snow, inches of snow on the ground, with that could be, up to 20, 30 degree swing in temperature from the time they get on the plane to the time they get off the plane and then have to perform a certification evaluation test. So because you have done some work in this field and are probably one of the best exercise physiologists I know, since you had me trapped up here in Alaska, where we sit today at Barton Booster's Happy Trails Kennels, teaching some Oklahoma State students about canine sports medicine and exercise physiology. The real reason that I wanted to talk to you today is to see how you can help us, handlers, prepare our dogs, if that is even possible. And while I use the term acclimatization, you corrected me. And more, it's like, how do we get our dogs to perform well physically in these changes in environment? So maybe tell me why you corrected me on acclimatization, the term, and what we're really looking at to accomplish.
Well, I guess to put to bed the idea of the acclimatizations term, the general public will use that term to sort of describe a very, very broad topic of humans or horses or dogs or whatever becoming better at dealing with an environment that they're not necessarily used to. So in a very, very broad general term. In the scientific community, the term acclimatization takes on a much, much more precise meaning. It is, for example, the dog's body is normally designed to operate correctly at an average temperature about 100.5 to 101 degrees Fahrenheit. And so all the cells are sitting there at that temperature, and that's the temperature that they like. And if you get the cells hotter, they don't like that, and they don't work quite as well. In the scientific community, the term acclimatization refers to the phenomenon in which the cell itself can work effectively at temperature at higher than normal temperatures. So the cell itself is 103 or 103.5 or so, and despite that higher temperature, it's still working fine. What's happening in the vast majority of cases in which the general public is perceiving acclimatization, it's a dog working in a hotter environment, but maintaining a normal temperature. So it's not that they get better at being hot, they get better at adapting to a hot environment around them while still staying the same temperature. So it may sound like splitting hairs, but it actually is a very, very important distinction, because there's a lot of information about how to remain at a normal body temperature in a hot environment. There's comparatively far less information on how to train a cell to operate at a higher temperature than normal and be happy about it. So most of what we know about the lay term acclimatization is actually just getting better at doing something that you were already doing at the lower temperature. You're better at dissipating heat when the temperature is 90 degrees outside than when the temperature was 70 degrees outside. That's what most people perceive, and it's a much, much more common phenomenon than true scientific acclimatization.
So our concern really then is revolving around how we get our dogs to physically perform in these environments,
right,
and with these changes from going from, no humidity, 50 degrees to 85 degrees and humid with a plane, mm-hmm, and then land on the ground and be able to perform physically effectively for whatever duration we need them to perform. And the additional part of that is that we also be working disaster sites. So these will be, unusual terrain and, and more physical activity, than just taking a walk or a hike, etc. So with that in mind, how can we practically, or can we, and what is the evidence for us to be able to prepare our dogs effectively for those things? And can we? And if we can't, then I guess we need to have a discussion of how we manage our dogs.
All right. And the thing to understand, or the best way to understand it, is to understand exactly what's happening when a dog is trying to thermoregulate, trying to maintain a desired body temperature, whatever that desired body temperature is. They're generating heat. It's an obligatory process of staying alive. All of the chemical reactions that result in your ability to stay alive are shedding heat in the process. And that heat has to be dumped somewhere. You can't just sit there and keep absorbing it, because that will cause your body temperature to go up, ultimately, potentially to a point where you can't live through it anymore. So you're going to be generating heat, and you're going to be generating heat more if you're working. So a transition from a resting to a trot, as a rule of thumb, going from resting to a trot is going to increase the rate of heat production fourfold. Means that you have to increase the rate of heat dissipation fourfold, otherwise you're going to eventually overheat. If you're going faster, you're generating heat faster, you have to dissipate heat faster. So how do you actually dissipate heat? The very first step is you have to get the heat out of where it was generated, which is the skeletal muscle during exercise, and you have to transport it somehow to the point in the body where it's going to be dumped out into the environment. If you're a human, you have your entire skin surface as well as your respiratory tract in order to, that is interacting with the environment and can potentially dissipate heat. If you're a dog, you don't quite have that resource. I mean, dogs obviously have skin, but a dog's skin is not designed to dissipate heat that much.
The fur.
Because of the fur, because of the lack of sweat glands, and because of some anatomic differences, that because the dog's not designed and never intended to dissipate heat from its skin, it doesn't have the blood vessels to deliver the heat to the skin to be dissipated. So even if you completely remove all the hair, you're still not going to get that much more heat dissipation in the average dog. You'll get some, but not a huge amount. A dog relies almost entirely on its respiratory tract to dissipate additional heat. So a dog can dissipate enough heat across the skin, across the respiratory tract, and all that at rest without having to pant. We see them do it all the time. But when you increase the heat production, The dog has to do something to increase heat dissipation. And the only thing a dog can do to increase heat dissipation is to increase the heat flow out of the respiratory tract. That's why they pant. Humans can simply dilate blood vessels in their skin and increase rate of heat dissipation through the skin. Dog doesn't have that ability.
So shaving our dogs down or just breeding naked dogs isn't going to help.
It's not going to. It will probably help a little bit, but it's not. It will increase the rate of heat, the basal rate of heat dissipation across the skin, but the dog doesn't have the blood vessels to dilate to increase the heat delivery to the skin to increase the heat dissipation from the skin. So they have the only thing that they can actively increase is the respiratory heat dissipation.
So increase panting.
Increase panting, exactly. But that's the only thing that the dog can do. And so it becomes progressively more and more important the harder you're working the dog, or the harder it is for the dog to dissipate heat. You know, that's like I say, that's the one thing, the only thing that they can actually change.
So can we, through the function of training or other things, improve our dog's response to heat and the changes in the temperature? I mean, is it hopeless that we're never going to be able to, fully prepare our dogs for these changes, rapid changes in environment, and the fact that we also then have them perform a lot of physical performance? There's search work.
Yeah, the advantage that we have is that when it comes to being an athlete, and heat dissipation is part of being an athlete. You have to be able to increase heat dissipation because you are going to increase heat production by exercising. A dog is a better athlete than a human. And so they are, in fact, they come to us designed to be able to do this very, very well already. We just have to make sure that all those systems continue to work. That key system of being able to generate enough blood flow to not only collect the heat from the working muscle, but then also at the same time have enough blood flow to send it through their gums and send it through their tongue and send it through all of those mucous membranes in their mouth and nose and dump it. All that's coming out of the same heart. And so we have to maintain that ability of the heart to produce that much blood flow so that you have that much to go around. And that's probably the single biggest thing that we can pay attention to regardless. The dog, when you're getting your dog physically fit, it will take weeks, perhaps even months of meticulous exercise to get the dog really, really fit. And part of that fitness is increasing the capacity of the cardiovascular system to pump blood. And a big part of increasing the cardiovascular system to pump blood is simply giving them more blood to pump. And that, it improves the filling of the heart, and then it gives the heart more blood to pump with each beat, and you wind up with more blood flow per minute. And you can send some to the mouth and some to the muscles, and everybody gets some. That's done basically by expanding blood volume with water. And it's also removed by removing water. So when a dog gets dehydrated, the first thing that goes is that increased ability to pick up heat from the muscle and drop it off in the respiratory tract for them to pant out the heat into the environment around them. You can spend weeks increasing cardiovascular capacity. You can lose it in hours during exercise through dehydration.
So before we move on to the hydration component of this, so aerobic conditioning you feel would be more important, or an important aspect of maintaining our dogs or building in our dogs to potentially make them more capable of adapting to these changes in environment and exposure to heat and being able to physically perform.
Aerobic conditioning almost always results in increased cardiovascular capacity. We typically quantify aerobic capacity as VO2 max, or the maximum amount of oxygen that the subject can consume during really, really, really strenuous exercise. And a key component of that is having a robust cardiovascular system to be able to do everything that needs to be done, at maximal exercise. But in the case of a search and rescue dog, you're almost never exercising at that intensity.
Correct. And especially, the nature of our deployments are quite fast. We might have a 9/11 or a surf side where we're in a, smaller footprint and we're just working over rubble, which, has its own, needs strength, balance, and proprioception and those kinds of things more for that. But then things like the Texas floods, the 4th of July floods, post-Helene up in North Carolina in the mountains, we were hiking 5 to 7 miles in a day. So we certainly got to also be physically prepared for all of these different aspects of environments, especially in our urban search and rescue dogs. So we certainly don't need the capacity an Iditarod dog does. But, if our training is mostly, kind of in the sprint dog realm, right? We might do a 5-minute search on the rubble, do 5 of those on a weekend, 3 weekends a month. Are our dogs really prepared then to go out and do 5 to 7 miles in Texas in July?
Yeah. I mean, it's likely if the only training you ever do is, 5 to 10 minute little bouts on a rubble pile, you're probably not generating enough physiologic stress to result in a measurable increase in cardiovascular capacity. And at that point, you don't need it, so that's why you don't get it. But you may need it for something else. When we're talking about training a greyhound, and we want their aerobic capacity to increase, we want the aerobic capacity of the greyhound to increase because we need them to burn more oxygen for the next, 30 seconds to a minute. And we're not that worried about heat dissipation. We can worry about that after the race is done. That they develop a lot of cardiovascular capacity in order to deliver oxygen. But that same cardiovascular capacity then turn around and with the dog exercising at 50% of its maximal effort, but for a longer period of time, you have the cardiovascular capacity to transport heat. It's the same blood. It's the same circulatory system. It's just increasing its capacity to do something slightly different with the same tools. So instead of really, really high levels of oxygen delivery, you have very, very high levels of heat transfer, and it still serves the same thing. But you have to induce the body to produce that increased capacity. It doesn't just happen, and that's really one of those areas where, like you suggested, even if it's not necessarily a specific component of the average search, there may be times when, for whatever reason, you need more cardiovascular capacity to offset a challenging heat environment. And you have to put that in, you have to put that on board before you get to that search.
Right. So sounds like we can influence this more through fitness than necessarily exposure. So people talking about, I want to get my dog used to the heat, so therefore I'm going to kennel it outside and, just provide it with more exposure to heat, or I'm not going to let it ever sit in air conditioning and just allow its exposure. Would we be able to influence their tolerance for physical activity and heat by doing any of those things?
Well, you can to the extent that you expose them to it. So if kenneling the dog outside in the heat will result in them becoming adapted and physiologically capable of tolerating being kenneled in the heat.
That doesn't equate to exercise in the heat.
Exactly. They're not going to get better at a more stressful environment unless you actually put them in that stressful environment. So it's like I can sit here and lift 5-pound weights all day long. It's not going to prepare me to lift a 50. In order to get prepared to lift a 50, you have to eventually lift a 50. So, the idea of increasing aerobic capacity in order to increase the capacity to deal with heat at a submaximal level is kind of some of the thinking behind cross training type stuff. We're basically cheating and fooling the cardiovascular system, and the cardiovascular system is not smart enough to recognize that this is a different set of circumstances. It just, the heart beats faster and pumps more blood, and we get a different outcome. So, we don't necessarily need to work a dog in the heat in order to gain the capacity to dissipate heat under those conditions, but you do have to stress the cardiovascular system somehow.
So your advice to, I'm going to pick on Washington State, it's my home state.
Sure.
Take a, dog from Washington State, gets deployed to, and this has happened, I know, gets deployed to Florida in August. It's hot, humid, post-hurricane. And we're, working, 10, 12-hour shifts. So based on what we've talked about, it sounds like making sure that in addition to its rubble work, short bursts over that they also should have a component of more endurance type activity that has stressed
the cardiovascular system. Correct. So that ideally, and these numbers aren't for anything more than illustration. They're not data-based per se, but if you need a dog to work in South Florida, for 15, 20-minute searches at really hot, humid conditions, that dog is going to require a more well-developed cardiovascular system to be able to handle that heat dissipation task. You can get that cardiovascular system in Washington State by taking the dog on 10-mile runs. And it builds the cardiovascular system, and now that the dog that's fit enough for a 10-mile run in 40 degrees in Washington State has the cardiovascular system to handle the heat dissipation of 90 degrees for 15 minutes in Florida. So the cardiovascular system is a lot able to use the same approach to do a lot of different things. And it doesn't necessarily specifically have to be heat exposure in order to improve heat exposure in a different environment.
So we need to make sure our dogs are really fit.
You need to, there's nothing wrong with fitness. The more fit they are, the more adaptable they are going to be to any of the conditions that get thrown at them.
Yeah. And as somebody that specializes in sports medicine and rehabilitation, I don't like fat dogs of any kind. And so fit is better. And, and that's probably a topic of lots of other conversations is how do we get our dogs there without, chronic repetitive use injuries and so on and so forth. That's a topic for maybe another disaster dog podcast takeover. But do you have any just, other than the 10-mile hike, is there any other things that you might be able to, what could I do for my dogs to have them more prepared that would be practical and easy to do?
One of the things, and we're going to touch on this, I think, repeatedly, is that, I mentioned already, we can put a lot of effort into building a cardiovascular system. And we can undo that very, very quickly by allowing the dog to get dehydrated. So one of the things that separates a lot of really good sled dog racers from the ones that are not quite as good is that they have taken advantage of the inherent relationship between, the musher and the dog. The inherent relationship is that the musher is the most important thing in the dog's world, and the dog wants to do everything it possibly can to make the musher happy because, that's the nature of dogs. So the musher takes advantage of that by making the dog believe that certain things are what I want you to do, like drink. So, the dogs are going to lose water through urinary losses, through respiratory losses. I mean, they're going to dump water out. We've documented the requirements as high as 6 liters a day off of an average sized working dog. You got to get 6 liters back into them in order to get them hydrated. And the best way of doing that is to simply have them drink. But the problem is that they don't always think that they're thirsty. So you train the dog, and this isn't something that you start doing during deployment. This is something that you start doing when you're training for everything else. You simply put the water bowl in front of the dog, and when the dog drinks, you praise it. You tell them that this is what makes you happy. And you do that over and over and over again. And somewhere down the road, when they're dehydrated and they're sluggish and they don't really feel like drinking, and you put the water bowl in front of them, they're like, yeah, I don't really feel like drinking, but it'll make daddy happy or mommy. and so I'll go ahead and drink, and voila. It doesn't really matter why the dog took the water in, whether it was thirsty or whether it was just trying to make you happy. Right. The point is that the water is now inside the dog. And so those are some of the things that we found, whether it's racing sled dogs or explosive detection dogs or search and rescue dogs or whatever, taking advantage of that bond to help the dog help themselves is a huge asset that will separate the dehydrated dog from the not dehydrated dog. And the hydrated dog is the one that can continue to work and thermoregulate and not overheat.
Has increased
because they've
circulating. Yeah,
they've replaced what they lost, and so they have that robust blood volume that you spent so much time conditioning them to have, and now it's back because they drank water and they absorbed it, and everything's great again.
Yeah, and one method we use fairly commonly is baiting water. Mm-hmm. Putting something in there that makes it more tasty.
Yep.
Cat food or, flavoring, juice off of
tuna juice,
whatever. and no harm in that, right? As far as that goes. So certainly if that increases their consumption, or it's a behavioral increase in consumption because they want to please us, I guess one of the things to discuss is, where this dehydration is coming from, because dogs don't sweat, right? That's right. Kind of one of the things that we always talk about with dogs don't sweat. So it's not that they are not getting dehydrated in the face of exercise then. I think probably the biggest differentiation is they're just not losing like sodium and chloride like horses and people do.
Yeah, they're not losing quite as much salt, although they do lose quite a bit. They just lose it through the urine instead of the instead of the water that they're evaporating in order to cool. So, but they will still lose a lot of salt through the urine, and it's it's a very complicated metabolic sort of process, but it's not true that dogs don't need more salt when they're exercising. They do. It's for a different reason. They're not losing it through sweat, but they are urinating a lot, and they lose a lot of salt when they do that you have to replace. But the cooling aspect, they're losing pure water off of their respiratory tract. And so relative to humans or horses, they may not need as much salt.
So they don't need the Gatorade per se.
Not the Gatorade, although, going back to the whole baiting, thing, we've had some pretty good success giving them Gatorade. We just don't mix it up full strength. It's really, really weak Gatorade. It still looks blue or pink or purple or whatever the flavor happened to be that day. But if you were to drink it, you wouldn't be impressed.
And how much fluids are they losing through panting?
An aggressively panting dog can lose up to a half a liter an hour through panting.
A lot.
It's a lot. I mean, on any given breath, they're losing about 50 microliters. On any given breath, they're not losing very much at all, but they are breathing a lot. And it does start to add up.
So in the course of a 4-mile hike in Texas in July.
Yeah, depends on how.
And the search. I mean, they're actively searching. If
that's about an hour, they've probably lost at least a half a liter in that 1 hour.
So goals would be to try and replenish at least a half a liter in 1 hour.
Now, when they turn around and pee, they've lost more, and that's also stuff that you have to replace. Overall, we documented, like I say, up to 6 liters a day in dogs that are performing, sort of a stop and start 9-hour patrol.
And this was working
with the
military,
Marine Corps. Yeah. Marine Corps off-leash detection dogs. So
EOD.
Very, very similar overall dog activity. They were just looking for bombs instead of people.
Correct. So it'd be similar to our HRD deployments like Helene and Texas and Lahaina.
They were using Labrador retrievers and like I say, 5.5 to 6 liters a day. Which is if they pee it out, if they exhale it out, however they lose it, you have to get it back into them.
And how well did they do getting it back into their dogs?
That was it was really easy to figure out how much they were losing. It was a whole lot harder to figure out how to get it back into them. Because like you say, we have to, we can rely on them to be thirsty, at least initially. We noticed that the longer they worked, the less thirsty, or at least the less they were willing to voluntarily take in during the breaks. And so then you have to start, baiting it, or you have to start with the sort of, praise. And just like they don't feel like drinking, but we want them to drink, and that was compelling enough for enough of the dogs that we could keep them hydrated. You don't have to carry all of that water, because eventually that you're going to go back to home base or whatever it is. And you can bring a dog that is somewhat dehydrated to home base and then hydrate it there with stuff that you didn't have to carry, but you do have to carry quite a bit.
A lot.
It is
a lot of water.
It is a lot of water.
And just thinking of how my dog works and offering her water when we, go a distance, stop. She might drink half a bowl.
Right.
Baiting, praise, whatever, I do and such. And two is some dogs, especially if they're on the verge of getting a little hot, which will be our next, that they don't want to stop panting to drink.
Right.
They're more inclined to cool themselves off than drink. Usually I feel a little bit better when my dog actually starts to drink, when I feel like they've gotten a little hot, because I feel like, well, they're stopping trying to keep themselves from dying and are ready to drink at this stage. So, I guess that, kind of comes to, another thing is that we have, periodically in the past used, varying degrees of subcutaneous fluids to help rehydrate dogs. There was a push initially to prehydrate, which, looking at kind of human athletes and such, don't really feel like that's an effective method of, preventing dehydration issues. When I was on Maryland Task Force 1, working with another group, looked at a preliminary study to see if prehydration would decrease search times. So we had the dogs kind of kept, in a trailer, with the AC on, so they weren't getting hot in anticipation of exercise as best we could control. And then we set up a basic search that all certified dogs that we knew they could accomplish within, pretty reasonable period of time. And what I found is that actually the prehydration of fluids, or giving them subcutaneous fluids prior to the search, actually increased their search times. And that seems counterintuitive until you see how many times the dogs exited the pile to go pee. Because they didn't need the fluids. They were normally hydrated going into work, if not overhydrated. So the body's response to that is peeing it out. So, then the flip side of this, the dog then works, and then we need to compensate for this. Should we be giving our dogs a bunch of sub-Q fluids? Then in the middle, should we be carrying sub-Q fluids as well if they're not willing to drink during the course of the search, especially if they're more prolonged ones versus the true building collapse ones where we have a small footprint and it'll be more stop and start. Should we be not only, giving them oral water to drink, but should we also be giving them sub-Q fluids in these situations as well?
I mean, I'm not going to say that sub-Q fluids is, just absolutely wrong. There are certainly benefits to the sub-Q fluids. You just have to be realistic about what you're accomplishing. Like I say, if you're faced with trying to somehow get 6 liters of water into the dog, and let's say that you can, you're really, really aggressive and you can get 500 mils under their skin in one shot. Well, that does mean that you're sticking them 12 times a day in order to do that. So
my dogs are good, but I'm not sure by the end of the search would be that good.
It accomplishes at most, 500 mils out of the 6,000 that you're actually going to need to keep the dog fully hydrated. And like you say, it depends a lot on the context. If you're trying to get ahead of the curve, you're not going to get quite as far ahead of the curve because you'll put 500 in and the dog will decide that, well, that was 300 too much. And so they're just going to go ahead and piss that out now. And so you put 500 in, but you really only saved yourself 200 that the dog doesn't need to drink now. Because
that's not that much.
It's just not very much.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like I say, it's not absolutely wrong per se, but too many people somehow come up with the logic of, I'm going to stick 500 mils under the dog's skin, and now I don't have to carry water when we go out for 9 hours. And it's like, no, you're still going to have to, because even if he absorbed all 500, which he won't,
you're still 5,500 behind.
Yeah, and so you're not in many cases, folks don't realize that they're not accomplishing nearly as much as they think they are.
Right. And then, when we get back to, our base of operations and, settle in for the night, So how much are we behind? Should we then put IV catheters in and start bolusing fluids?
Yeah.
I mean, from a veterinary standpoint, we would never, put dogs on IV drips
Right.
for that, because then we would have to get like 5 liters IV in them, and we would.
It takes,
a mil per pound per hour is.
It takes a little while.
Hours, days,
Yeah.
to safely give IV
Right.
fluids as a bolus, because again, what they don't use immediately, they're going to urinate out.
For the amount of time that you're spending doing that, if you instead invest in trying to figure out how to get the dog to drink it voluntarily, you're way further ahead.
Yeah, that's good to have all of these methods and kind of discuss how we replenish dehydration, because we talked about obviously we have to have fit dogs, that'll help, but we also need to be very cognizant of the hydration status of our dogs, which can be very difficult to assess in the field, right? We use the skin tent methods and look at mucous membranes and see how dry they are and what their capillary refill time is, but those are pretty crude, and to have really significant changes in those parameters, they're pretty dehydrated already. So we would really prefer to not get there, right? So having just a maintenance, plan, it's like, listen, we're going to try and accomplish them getting this amount of fluids per unit time is a better strategy, than, using some of these things where it's too little or too little, too late, kind of thing. So,
well, and there are some things that just based on the big picture, you can take to the bank. If your dog has been out working for 2 hours without having anything to drink, you can safely assume that it is now dehydrated. I mean, no matter what the skin tent does or whatever, it's like if he's really been out there working for 2 hours without having anything to drink, assume that it's dehydrated. You're going to be right 85 to 90% of the time. And, what are you going to do as a first step? Well, you probably should have stopped and let the dog drink sooner.
Right. Because what the overarching thing, next thing I want to talk about is what we're really trying to do is prevent heat injury as well. I mean, there's lots of other things we want our dogs to be able to physically perform in these environments. The big thing we're really trying to do is prevent heat injury, which I'm especially sensitive to, having lost a dog to heat stroke, exertional hyperthermia. I was deployed with my human remains detection dog to Hurricane Michael, and had left one of my lifeline dogs at home with a dog sitter, and obviously not maliciously, she was out playing ball with her in the yard, and I get a call that she was started seizuring and was on her way to the vet hospital while I was up in the Mexico Beach area. Ended up losing her 3 days later, multiple transfusions and critical care. But unfortunately, we ended up losing her. And certainly there's been lots of reports of dogs, law enforcement dogs being lost to exertional hyperthermia. You've dealt with the military, obviously, can probably weigh in on what, the concerns and what their incidence is there. And certainly we see it in search and rescue dogs, both wilderness as well as urban. So this is certainly something I think is super important that we're trying to prevent with some of these measures, make sure that our dogs aren't pushed beyond their physiologic limits. So maybe we can discuss a little bit about heat injury and heat stroke and the signs, of that. And then maybe we'll talk a little bit about, cooling and such as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. And I think it's very, very important in these sorts of conversations to make sure that everybody's using the same terms in the same manner. So, I see a lot of conversations where people use the term heat stroke and heat injury as if they mean the same thing. And they do not mean the same thing. It's important to understand the difference between the two terms. Heat injury is the proper way of describing a set of circumstances in which some tissue undergoes injury sufficiently that it it's not just that the tissue needs to cool off. That there has, in fact, been cellular damage, and you don't restore normal function simply through cooling. You actually have to make new tissue. There are forms of muscle damage. There are, we have data to show that a lot of the oxidative stress that goes along with exercise is in fact connected to the fact that the tissue got hot, and the heat generates the oxidative stress. There are things that happen to the intestinal tract that occur, and you set up a mild inflammatory response that even after the intestinal tract has cooled down, you still have damage and you still have to resolve the inflammation there. So all of that is considered heat injury. It's not necessarily fatal. In fact, in most cases, as long as you do cool down the tissue and give it time to heal, everything's going to be fine. May take days to weeks, but ultimately, all they really need is rest and time. Heat stroke is when you have gone much, much further. In human medicine, they generally agree that in the case of heat stroke, you have in fact damaged the central nervous system, the brain, and potentially the spinal cord. Big difference is that virtually every other tissue is capable of growing back. Brain's not.
And that's the seizures in my
that's the seizures, and that's and it's important. And there are when we were dealing with this in a consensus statement, a lot of people were arguing that you can have heat stroke without signs of brain damage. And so then people started arguing about, well, what do you mean by brain damage, or what do you mean by signs? And the general consensus was that there will be brain damage. It's not always, evident out, externally. It's like seizures are certainly one very, very clear sign. Coma is another.
What about, and I've done this playing with my dogs and recognize it, ataxia. We're looking a little weak and wobbly.
Yeah. I mean, that's somewhere on that
threshold.
That threshold. There may be damage. You may have killed a few neurons, but you didn't kill enough neurons that if you don't, as long as you promptly get the dog cold again, that everything will be fine. They may be missing a few neurons, but you won't be able to tell.
Now, come on.
But yeah, that ataxia, that kind of wobbliness. I mean, yeah, you're sitting there right on the edge of tipping over into a status that everybody would agree qualifies as heat stroke. Heat stroke is life-threatening, life-altering. You don't necessarily fully recover from heat stroke. The heat injury, you fully recover from. Heat stroke, you probably don't completely recover from it.
Right.
Because you have, in fact, damaged a tissue that doesn't have the capacity to fully heal itself.
Right. And heat is just a normal physiologic response to exercise. And so all of this is just pushing the body's past its ability to tolerate that degree of heat generation within the body.
Correct. So, obviously, heat stroke is a medical emergency.
Right.
There is no such thing as overreacting to that.
Right. And what did you find with your work with because you've worked with both Customs and Border Patrol and the military, is obviously a big concern. The nature of the deployment for military working dogs has obviously historically been also similar to us in hot environments, such as the sandbox over Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. So
we look forward to picking a fight with Norway or Finland or something so that we can get a little bit of change.
We're going to talk about pool temperatures later as far as that goes. So,
but But yeah, I mean, I don't know off the top of my head the data quite as well. I know that, for example, in U.S. law enforcement, far more dogs succumb to heat injury than to trauma. I mean, it is a big problem, and I know that it's not a small problem in the military and customs and stuff like that. I don't necessarily know that it outranks trauma. Depends on the unit, I suppose. But it is definitely not a small problem for all of them.
Right. Thus, they were interested enough in it being a problem to have you do research.
Right. And they were, it was what you would expect in terms of we're less interested in, all the scientific minutia. We need you to make it go away. And so, what is the best way of making it go away?
That's kind of what I'm interested in, right?
Yeah.
What is the best way to make sure our dogs don't have this issue?
And so they funded a study that we published in the Journal of Special Operations Medicine. It's not something that you necessarily will find on every bookshelf, but nevertheless, it's a really, really neat journal that publishes high quality science on anything that relates to special operations in medicine, and they include their dogs in that.
Right.
So we did a cooling study. It was essentially what is the best field appropriate way of rapidly cooling a dog. So and it was field appropriate was very prominent in that. They didn't want stuff that they wouldn't have with them virtually anywhere they go.
Right, because it has to be practical, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you say you got to have this big fancy, cooling chamber, it's you're not going to follow a dog around with that.
And they were quick to point out that we're already carrying 85 to 90 pounds. Don't put anything else in our rucksack.
Right. So what did you find?
So essentially what we did was just, how effective is it to just dunk the dog in whatever body of water you can find wherever you are versus, putting them on a fan or moving air over them in one form or another. And then we also had some cooling pad that they envisioned, having this in, like a Humvee or a helicopter or something like that, something mechanical that they would have access to. Had an environmental chamber. We ran them on a treadmill. The heat generation and the environment was fully reproducible. So everything was getting compared, equally to everything else. And essentially what we found is that just as simple as dunking the dog in the biggest body of water that you can find is by far more effective than anything else. And you just dunk them and we were only dunking them for 5 minutes. And the body of water, in our case, we had a water trough inside the environmental chamber. So the water temperature was the same as the environmental temperature. It was just like if you were wandering around and you found, a ditch full of water out there and just, put the dog in that. But that was remarkably effective. You could get the dog all the way to the point that the dog was no longer panting in about 20 minutes.
And that's with 5 minutes of immersion.
5 minutes of immersion. And
how hot were you? How hot were they getting? They weren't obviously showing signs of heat.
No. We had them up to, I have to do the little math calculation because the graph that was in the thing was, in Celsius. And so that's not what everybody else deals in, but I guess they were up around 105 Fahrenheit. Not as hot as we can get a dog during exercise, but clearly they were hotter than they wanted to be. And
my dogs will typically 106, 107 after
the
search.
And so we were able to get them down. Like I say, by far the just putting a fan on them took more than an hour and a half to get them back to baseline.
What about water and a fan?
Didn't try water and a fan. It would probably work faster, at least initially, but you'd also probably need to, probably wind up dunking them again because they dry off quicker.
Right.
But this was just a very quick little study to sort of form a basis. And a lot of people have done follow-on studies on, if instead of a water trough, if we only have a baby pool, and so we can't get them quite as wet, or, dunking their head because we don't have enough water to dunk their entire body.
And alcohol.
Alcohol on the pads. Alcohol on the pads did almost nothing.
Right.
But large volumes of water applied somehow, whether it's a kiddie pool or a water trough or just dunking their heads. I mean, basically just getting water in contact with the dog as much as you possibly can is going to be the best way of cooling the dog.
And what's the mechanism of that if it's not cold?
Well, it's still going to be colder than the dog.
Right.
I mean, unless you're, I wouldn't recommend dunking them in a hot tub.
Okay. Also brings up every year, Janice Baker, Veterinary Tactical Group, always gets lots of reproductions of that. She does a lot of these kind of webinars. And one thing that always comes up that people jump on is that ice water immersion. Mm-hmm. People say we're going to kill dogs if we put them in ice water because they're going to get cold shock. Is that a concern?
I guess it depends on how much attention to detail you have. You can take a hot dog and you can certainly kill them in ice water if you leave them in there for a couple of hours.
Yeah, I don't think that's exactly what we're talking about.
But the idea is that so much of this comes up from trying to distill a relatively complicated scientific or biomedical concept into 140 characters or less so that you can tweet it. And so it says that, if you immerse them in cold water, you'll constrict the blood flow. And so and as a result, you won't cool them. Well, yeah, you will constrict the blood flow, but if you read the whole article, it says that the blood flow gets constricted when the dog's temperature gets below 100, which is too cold. You take them out of the cold water before they get there, and everything will be fine. They're not going to constrict their blood vessels until their body is telling them that now they're too cold, and we need to conserve heat.
Right, and that's what Janice's point as well. She's like,
but it is.
She advocates for the ice water baths because what they showed from me studying the literature is, especially looking at in military, Israeli military, and other sporting things. It looked at
humans,
ice water,
dogs, horses, the whole spectrum.
That they decreased the mortality from exertional hypothermia. I think it was in the Israeli military down to 0% by doing ice water immersion.
Yep. You just take them out when you've gotten them back down to body temperature.
Right.
And everything
approaching
or at least
normal.
closing that. Right. Yeah, exactly. And
so we should be monitoring these dogs during active cooling measures anyway. And so like I told the students, there is, whether you're talking about a human, a horse, or a dog, there is no such thing as cooling an overheated athlete too fast. There is such a thing as cooling them too much. And the stuff that is most effective at cooling, like ice baths, are the ones that put you at greatest risk of cooling too much. But it's a very, very easy thing to avoid. You monitor. Taking temperature.
You don't just leave them in the ice bath and go to lunch. You take their temperature, you keep examining the dog. I mean, if it required that level of intervention, you have no business turning your back on that patient until they're clinically normal anyway.
Yeah. And what recommendations that we use, at least in the USAR medical system, is to monitor temperature every 5 minutes. When they're 103, 103.5, you can stop active cooling measures and continue to monitor and make sure they're continuing towards normal.
Right. And
reasonable.
In the special operations study, one of the things that we found that was pretty reliable, a dog's, again, dealing in Celsius, a dog's normal temperature is about 38 C. Regardless of which cooling method we were using, the dog stopped panting at 39. So they're not all the way down to baseline, but they are cool enough that now their brain is telling them that it's no longer worth the effort of.
So we're discussing that, dogs, stop panting about 39 degrees Celsius, which with a quick chat GPT assist, 39 degrees is 102.2 Fahrenheit. So reasonably, we can assume that they're cool. So if they're in an ice bath or water, we can pull them out when they stop panting, or even before, like
before, yeah. But
like I mentioned,
when they stop, if you're monitoring them closely and they stop panting, you know that they are cool. They may not be all the way down to normal. They're certainly not below normal. But yeah, at that point, you can just pull them out.
Excellent. What about some other things? I know you mentioned, alcohol in the pad's not effective.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the cooling mat, which was cold water circulating through the mat.
Right.
Correct.
Right.
And that didn't help much.
It helped. It was better than just putting a fan on them. It wasn't as good as dunking them in water. It was right between the two.
What about other devices? We don't use these in the urban search and rescue world. I see them probably more in, kind of pet dog, as far as like the little ice things that they wear around their necks. Supposedly they like cool blood for their head. The coats that either are reflective coats or cooling coats to, help keep them or cool or prevent them from getting hot to begin with using that. Any validity to any of those kind of things?
I've not seen any, quality studies that would prove that they work. I do know of a lot of, of proven physiologic sort of facts and knowledge about dogs that would suggest that they won't work. Like we talked about earlier, dogs are not designed to move heat across their skin. They have a bunch of fur that is a very, very effective insulator. They don't have a whole lot of blood flow to the skin to, move their metabolic heat up to be dissipated, because it's not going to go anywhere. It's just going to be trapped by the fur. All of that also prevents stuff from external to the dog influencing the core of the dog. So you can put a cooling vest or cooling blanket on the dog, and it will cool their fur, but it won't necessarily go any further than that, because it wouldn't necessarily get all the way down to the skin. And even if it got all the way down to the skin, carrying that coolness into the rest of the body, you don't have the blood flow to do that. And so, you wind up getting very little bang for the buck, particularly the ones that are working by simply getting them wet. What you have most definitely done is make the dog heavier. And so now it's requiring more energy, and they're generating more heat to move, to trot around or, move around or walk or whatever. It's like walking with a backpack on as opposed to walking without a backpack. You're generating more heat. You may not be removing very much heat at all. The same thing for people who assert that dark-colored dogs are more prone to overheating in the sunlight than light-colored dogs. Because darker colors absorb solar radiation more effectively. And so when you have your yellow lab and your black lab standing out there in the sunlight and you reach down to pet them, the black lab will feel hotter. But what's actually hot is just their hair and not necessarily any part of the rest of their body, because again, fur is an insulator and it works in both directions. The lack of blood flow is an insulator and it works in both directions. For the same reason that the dog can't dissipate heat across the skin, they're also really, really bad at absorbing heat through the skin. And so there's a study in Australia of racing greyhounds that demonstrated that dark-colored greyhounds have higher core body temperatures than light-colored greyhounds. And if you read the article summary, that's what you get, and that is a correct statement. But when you get into the actual article, you discover that, number one, they had thousands and thousands and thousands of measurements that gave them the statistical power to detect differences that are not biologically significant. And what they found was that, yes, the dark-colored dogs were warmer than the light-colored dogs, but it was a tiny fraction of a degree.
So I don't have to worry about, as an owner of 6 black labs.
The difference is so trivial compared to what the dog's going to do by simply walking instead of laying down. It really is not something that we should concern ourselves with. We've got much, much larger challenges in helping the dogs thermoregulate than their coat color. The coat color has a trivial impact.
So that's good to know, because that's kind of one of those old dog handlers' tales.
Well, and to say it, and it comes from the fact that they definitely do feel hotter when you put your hand on their outer coat.
But they're not more susceptible to the heat.
No, absolutely not.
Excellent. Well, let's switch gears a little bit. Then you talked about, them being good insulators as far as their skin. So we're sitting up here in Alaska, I think it was negative 22 this morning.
It was.
And now we're warmed up to 6.
We have a heat wave. It's 6 degrees Fahrenheit.
6 degrees, which this, even though I'm a Washington native, now Florida transplant, this is totally do not have enough clothes for this, as far as that goes. But, I go out and we're staying at the kennel and in the B&B they have there, and I look out across the field of sled dogs, on their huts, and perfectly unbothered by the negative degree. I mean, some of them are hunkered down in their little houses, so they obviously are well adapted to their cold environment. Obviously in our urban search and rescue, we've had very few deployments that have involved the cold. Probably the Oso mudslides is the closest we got, because it was April in Washington State and it was cold and wet and muddy. And we did have some dogs that, were cold, not hypothermic per se. Does that mean we just, obviously, these, sled dogs do well in very cold and, extremely cold environments. Do we not need to be concerned about cold as much as heat?
Well, you do have to be concerned with the cold, both from the standpoint of the cold itself, but also what the cold can do and what the dogs do in the cold. So believe it or not, I have seen just as many cases of overheating in racing sled dogs as I have in military working dogs. You wouldn't ever expect coming up here, that overheating would be a problem, but it still remains the fact that, overheating is an imbalance between the rate that heat is being generated and the rate that heat is being dissipated. And yeah, you can dissipate heat really, really quickly in a very, very cold environment, but dog is capable of generating heat really, really fast when they exercise. They just exercise a little bit harder in the cold, and they get the same imbalance. And so we still have dogs that will come into checkpoints with rectal temperatures of 108 and staggering and weaving and having trouble. Now, the one common theme between the racing sled dogs and the Marine Corps explosive detection dogs or search and rescue dogs or a lot of these other more temperate environment dogs is the link of dehydration. They will still
They'll get
lose.
dehydrated
They
in the
lose
cold.
dehydrated. They get dehydrated in the cold, and when they get dehydrated in the cold or in the hot or whatever, they progressively lose the ability to move the heat from the muscle to the dissipation surfaces. And so they wind up, if they can't dissipate it, they wind up storing it. And storing it raises body temperature. And so, it is just as common because the dogs are basically going to try to exercise up to the point that they can't. And up here, that can't level still winds up being, heat dissipation. It's just at a slightly higher exercise intensity.
Interesting. So if we ever get deployed to cold environments, we still have to be concerned about the same things.
I mean,
maintaining hydration, having a good fit dog that can exchange that heat appropriately.
If they have a robust cardiovascular system, they're less prone to frostbite because they have enough they have enough blood flow to keep all the different parts of the dog warm and prevent frostbite. So dehydrated dogs get frostbite. Fully hydrated dogs don't.
So good mushers are maintaining hydration.
Good mushers are maintaining hydration. And like I say, it's the same study that we published documenting the 5 to 6 liters of daily water requirement in explosive detection dogs also had sled dogs in it. And by God, they had the same.
And any different requirements in the sled dogs versus the military working dogs? I mean, sled dogs obviously being endurance, doing long periods of probably more strenuous exercise than the EOD dogs.
Yeah.
Did they have more dehydration, or is it about the same because it's all respiratory loss?
It's all, well, not all, but most of it is respiratory loss. What basically happens is that the dogs exercise to the point that it becomes physiologically problematic. If you're an explosive detection dog running around at 85 degrees Fahrenheit, that you hit that wall at about 25 miles of trotting. If you're a sled dog in single digit Fahrenheit temperatures, you hit that at about 100 miles of easy loping, but it's still the same barrier that you hit. And a good athlete works all the way up to that point of limitation, and then they run into problems.
All right. So same concepts. Doesn't matter the temperature. We need to do the same things.
We still preach hydration, and hydration solves so many problems that are the result of, the environment and the interaction between the environment and the work. But you basically work until you can't do it, and you can't do it because you're dehydrated and things are starting to fail.
And you'll increase your capacity by making sure you have a good level of aerobic fitness.
And then the ability to drink water. Right. You got since they're working for us, we have to provide them with the opportunity to drink.
Right. One kind of acclimatization, but not acclimatization, I wanted to just mention, we haven't deployed to altitude much as far as our search and rescue. Being a snob from Washington State, I did not consider the mountains in North Carolina that I was working as truly mountains. So I was unaffected by the altitude, even though I live at sea level now, but growing up skiing, etc. But I will say we had a conversation obviously several years ago because it was related to the Nepal earthquakes. And we had our 2 international teams were deployed over there. And obviously these earthquakes also impacted Everest, which is obviously both base camp and the upper camps were at higher altitude. And the question came through the IST veterinarians of whether or not the dogs, would be able to go to altitude. And altitude is a huge issue in people, and I can speak from personal experience. Shortly after I came back from the mountains in North Carolina, I went to Colorado to Frisco, which is at elevation. And my friend and I decided we were going to go on a hike, and we picked a hike that was described in the guidebook as suitable for families and children. We got probably 100 yards, and I could not friggin' breathe. It was like, well, I've pretty much found my limits that if we ever had to do a search at altitude, bless those, those SAR teams that work at altitude. Obviously, they're beasts. But I was, curious. We had a conversation. She said, oh, yeah, the dogs will be fine at base camp, potentially up to camp 2 if you even need it. He says, but the humans will have to be on supplemental oxygen, but the dogs will be okay. Can you elaborate on that just a little bit?
Well, just a little bit. We did do several years worth of work that was sort of centered around the military's desire to understand, the tolerance of dogs to acute exposure to high or relatively acute exposure to high altitude, similar to what you're talking about, where they're not necessarily going to have the ability to acclimatize. They're not going to be able to have time to make more red blood cells and change the way the red blood cells carry oxygen and fun stuff like that. It's going to be faster than that. So they wanted to see how tolerant the dogs would be. And yeah, the short answer is that dogs are a heck of a lot more tolerant to altitude than we are. A lot more. We played around with it quite a bit, but it also, brought home a very, very critical concept is that we're not looking at it from the standpoint of how high can they go before they die. That's not actually what we're doing this for. We want them to be able to work, which is, short of dying, just like, how hot can a dog get? We don't want them to die, but we also, if they're going to be in that environment, they need to be doing something productive. Otherwise, what's the point? So we looked at it with altitude stuff and the, like I say, I can't give you the exact numbers because, well, the military told me that they didn't want me telling people other than them what those exact numbers were, and they paid for it, and so that's their call. But yeah, the dogs were considerably more tolerant in terms of the lack of any sort of demonstrable physical impairment. And like you say, we were on oxygen. We're flying around in a C-130 at some undisclosed altitude with the back cracked open, so that the cargo area was at equilibrated with altitude, and we're all on oxygen, and we're throwing tennis balls up and down the cargo area and letting the dogs retrieve the tennis balls, and they're having the time of their lives. I couldn't have run halfway down the thing without an oxygen mask. They were doing great.
It's kind of how I felt.
Yeah, it's like families and children, but not Floridians.
Yeah, that was bad. I think I called my search team manager after that. I said I found my limit. So if we ever have to deploy to high elevations, you might have to drop me at the top of the mountain and I'll walk down.
Right.
And the dog will be just fine. However.
But the altitude stuff and to a certain degree the other environmental extremes, it applies the same. The dog's ability to do its job will become impaired at a less severe environmental condition than the dog's ability to survive.
So that becomes like efficacy of work.
Right.
So we talked initially about, can a dog physically perform?
Yeah.
But how, especially at some of these limits, how good are they doing their job? Is my dog actually detecting?
Right.
At those thresholds?
Yeah. I mean, can I jog a dog around at 90 degrees and 50% relative humidity, with the dog jogging around at 6.5 miles an hour? Can he? Yeah, I've done that over and over and over again. Or, can I have a dog, running at 20 below zero? Yeah, we do it all the time. Can the dog detect an odor target under those conditions? That's a completely different, question. I know that they can survive those conditions.
So what point are they not capable of detecting their target odor?
The problem is
it's already hard.
Yeah, the problem is that in most cases we don't really know. We have some very, very crude data to suggest that, well, obviously people know that if the dog is constantly panting, it's less effective than if it's sniffing.
Correct, because they actually have to close their mouth to take.
To sniff. And so, if the dog may be alive, but if the only way it's staying alive is by constantly panting and never actually sniffing, there's still odor that's getting there, but it's not nearly as much as if they're sniffing. And so maybe maybe we're at a point where the dog has to pass within 2 feet of the target before there will be enough odor to get to the nerve endings under those conditions. Whereas, when they're able to sniff, they can pick up and follow the trail from 50 or 100 feet away. It's like, can you really do a 2-foot grid? It's like at that point, it's kind of like, I'm not sure that this is really effective in the big picture.
Right. So if we're working, again, back to Texas, miles riverbank.
Yeah.
Over trees and brush and in the water and in the mud and in and out.
Yeah.
At what stage, my dog's not overheated yet, but is there efficacy of their work there?
At that point is the net, sort of situation. You're at more risk of overheating and damaging your dog than you are at risk of actually finding a target.
So you've long exceeded the capacity of their nose to find odor before they reach their physical limits.
Yeah, and we talk about the same thing for the cold. I mean, we know just based on physical chemistry that there will be less odor available from, if we're talking about explosives. You drop most of the explosives down to minus 20 Fahrenheit. There's almost no vapor coming off of them. There's almost nothing for the dog to detect.
So very low threshold.
And so, you combine that with the fact that the dog, just like you and I, when we get out there and start breathing that cold air, what happens to our upper airways?
It's dry.
Oh, it gets dry, and then we start secreting a lot of snot.
Yeah.
And that snot is a barrier to the cold air, but it's also a barrier to the odor.
Right. The same thing happens in dogs.
And the same thing happens in dogs.
So mucus secretions in the face of
and so the combination of less odor and this tenacious mucus barrier between where that odor might possibly be and where the nerve ending is, and you have every reason to believe that the dog is just simply not effective at some low temperature that will be higher than when you start worrying about the health and well-being of the dog itself. So, I mean, we spend a lot of time talking about whether or not we can create an environment where the dog can survive, where we can avoid damaging the dog. But it's my belief that the point at which there's no point in having the dog out there
is a much less severe environment. And I don't know in every single case, or in hardly any case, exactly where that line is drawn, but it's my belief that the dog loses its ability to be an effective member of the team long before you're worried about whether the dog is actually going to survive.
Or even just getting fatigued.
Yeah. And so, that's work that needs to desperately be done, because that, if we stop because we're worried about the dog's health and well-being, we've probably been working in an environment where the dog was generating false negative after false negative after false negative, and there wasn't really any point to be out there with the dog anyway.
So those areas all need to be researched.
Yes, we have, and we in the community, we've talked about it. We know how to do this. We know what the tools are going to need to be to do it, but it is going to be an enormously expensive effort to start to define those limits.
Because they're not necessarily observable.
No.
And the detector can't provide any input to tell us, hey, I can't smell shit now.
Right. And it's like, it ain't here. This is a negative. This is a negative. It's like, and we, with fatigue, I remember, one of the Marine Corps exercises that we did where, we were taking the dogs out and we were getting them fatigued, and we needed to give them motivation to keep working. And so they were all imprinted on C4. And so we would take satchels of C4 and we'd just scatter them out in the training area for the dogs to find as they went jogging along. But they'd get progressively more and more tired, and eventually we'd call it a night. And one of us would have to go out on a little four-wheeler and pick up all the satchels and put them back in the explosives locker. And so we do all that, and we're sitting there. We've got all these, we've got a 2-foot stack of C4 satchels sitting on the front of the four-wheeler. As the dog teams go walking by back into the kennel, not a single one of them raised their head and looked at the explosive that they had been imprinted to find. And we all sat there watching them. And then one of the kennel guys kind of goes, "Well, that was a miss." and the dogs had just,
How many of them had walked odor when they were out in the course of the exercise?
Oh, and before noon or in the early afternoon, they'd home right in on it.
But late in the day, they were walking odor.
In the day when they were just totally gassed.
They're walking their odor. Yeah.
They're just like, we're not interested in playing this game anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be, because that's obviously it's all well and good. We can detect, our dog's exertion and, fatigue and, or they're starting to get overheated and such. But I guess that efficacy, when is that point where they're really just not being an effective detector for us anymore? It's just that's a big unknown.
Yeah.
And, no way without the data, there's no way to plan around it. It's like, because that goes right back into work rest cycles and, and regardless of cooling, because they may not be that hot or, at that stage either. We just don't know.
Well, and that's the thing is that we don't have a good feel for a standardized work rest cycle. We don't have that yet.
No, but it can also.
Once we have that,
right.
We also have every reason to believe that work rest cycle will be vastly different if we drop the temperature 50 degrees. And so now we have to do it all over again. Or we take that standardized work rest cycle and we increase the environmental temperature by 20 degrees. Now we have to do it all over again. I mean, it's been too cost prohibitive to do it once. So
let alone doing
it. And we would have to do it 20 or 30 times to start to build at least some reasonable guesstimate framework to say, under these environmental conditions, we need to set the work rest cycle thusly.
So we just guess in the meantime.
And so, we just guess in the meantime.
So take-homes for our urban search and rescue handlers. 3 take-homes.
3 take-homes. You improve your ability to operate in any environmental extreme by doing increased cardiovascular fitness and maintaining hydration of the dog once you have increased cardiovascular fitness. Doesn't matter whether it's cold, hot, high altitude, whatever. We have data to show that they are better off with increased cardiovascular fitness and meticulous attention to hydration during the work. Is that 1 or 2?
I'll give you 2 for that
Okay.
one. Don't make you think too hard.
And then the third one is that if you get to the point where you have evidence that the dog is, losing the battle with whatever physiologic stress that, has been imposed by working in whatever specific environment, it is almost certain that you lost performance effectiveness earlier.
Right. I'll give it a third too. Cool them as rapidly as possible.
And cool them as rapidly as possible, no matter, but don't, if a dog is sufficient medical emergency to require rapid cooling, you don't turn your back on it.
Yeah. I don't think anybody would do that because everybody's pretty concerned when we have, that degree of a dog being hot and down and certainly.
I'll give you a fourth one.
Okay.
Whatever cooling method you're planning on using, don't let it be the first time the dog sees it when it actually needs it.
So
that should be part of training.
Like dunking it in a pool, or just like Dr. Otto's head dunk, training him to do that, or
it's like, you the first time you do that should not be when you actually need it.
Yes. Well, thankfully I have Labradors. They like water, so they jump in water all of the time. So that works out well for me. But there's some dogs that don't like water, or if you are having to hose them down, if that's what your access to water is, and you're hosing them down, that some dogs would rather eat the hose or the water spray than, be sprayed down, or you, depending on the direction your ears point. That certainly can be the case. Well, I think that wraps it up. Thank you, Dr. Davis, so much for agreeing to sit down with this. Thank you, Rami and Mike, for letting me take over the Disaster Dog podcast to talk about this subject, and hope all of you handlers out there get some great information from the topic.